everyone, you are listening to She Leads with Carly. Our guest today is the incredible Meg He, founder of ADAY. As an immigrant to the UK from China, Meg talks about her life growing up and how the person she is today is heavily influenced by her parents and the hard work they did throughout their life. As you will hear, her mother was one of the most hardworking entrepreneurs, so Meg always knew that being an entrepreneur was a possible career path. On the other hand, her passion for technology largely comes from her father. So with the anti-Asian hate crimes becoming a key issue recently, I have to mention that I am so honored to be able to share Meg's story and highlight not only an incredible leader, but also an incredible leader of Asian descent, who continues to inspire so many people. I hope this continues to shed light to the importance of highlighting these strong leaders from all different backgrounds. So without further ado, here is my chat with Meg. Enjoy! Hello, Meg. Thank you so much for joining She Leads today. How are you?
Extremely well. It's a delight to be here, Carly.
Thank you so much. So, Meg, you are currently the co-founder of ADAY, which is a fast-growing direct-to-consumer clothing brand. And obviously, we'll get into that. But before you founded ADAY, you were in product, the senior product and merchandising manager at Poshmark. You even went into venture capital as a seed investor at Cowboy Ventures, and you were also an analyst at Goldman. So all of that, you got your bachelor's from University of Oxford, you got your MBA from Stanford. So I want to go all the way back to getting your bachelor's from Oxford. At this moment, how did you see your career? Did you see yourself, one day starting a company, or what were you asking yourself to really navigate your next step?
Absolutely. So I think my story probably starts a little bit earlier than that. So my mother is an entrepreneur.
Okay.
And when I was around 11, she started a company. And I think that initially when she started a company, she wasn't sure what it was supposed to do. She just wanted to make more money for our family. So we are immigrants to the UK from China.
Wow.
And I helped her with it. I did her accounts and I typed her emails. Her English wasn't very good and actually still isn't very good.
Oh my God.
But what I saw was that none of these things, they stopped my mother. She just went forward and did it. And I think when we went into the UK, I wouldn't have described it like we were in poverty, but my whole family lived in one room above a Chinese restaurant. And now they live in a humongous house.
Wow.
And that was entirely the work of my mother. And so I think at the back of my mind, I always had this idea that, I didn't know if I wanted to be an entrepreneur, but I knew that this was a thing that was possible because I had seen it done.
Oh, incredible.
And on the other side, my father had a PhD in computational mechanics. So I knew there was stuff about technology that I found interesting. And I always had his books growing up. So he had a lot of books about coding. But when I was at college, I studied economics and management because I think that was the en vogue thing to do at the time.
Yeah.
And I think largely why I went to Goldman was because, it was 2007 and there was a huge boom in finance. I think everyone around me really wanted to get into finance. And I think that, there are definitely waves of things, right? If you ask the people around you, where should I be right now? People will tell you startups. But I think then, it was really around finance. I think these things do change depending on what companies are out there. And I would say that it wasn't so much that I was impressionable, but I didn't have a strong idea of what I wanted to do. And what I did want to be focused around is around learning. What is the place where I can learn the most? And I think at the time that was Goldman Sachs.
Yeah.
And then as the sort of currents changed, that eventually led me to kind of California, to Stanford, to Poshmark, and eventually to starting my own company.
Wow. Okay, so many questions I can go into. But first, it's amazing your story about your mom. You always have this inspiration. And not only that, did you ever have, whether it's at Oxford, whether it's going into Goldman Sachs, it seems like it's still probably a male-dominated field. And maybe would you attribute it to, having this amazing mother figure, being the badass, starting a company and whatnot? Was that kind of helped you, or did you ever have that self-doubt or that imposter syndrome thinking, okay, I'm a female, I look a little different than everyone else, that hindered it at all?
Yeah, I think, there was a lot of imposter syndrome basically kind of throughout my life. And I would say the dynamics in the UK are a little different.
Mm-hmm.
One is that there's a lot fewer Asian people.
Yeah.
I think there's actually a lot of Asian Americans at Stanford or in California.
Right.
but actually like the number of like British Asian people is a lot lower. Like it would be very rare that I could come across someone. Like in my entire class at Goldman Sachs, I would say probably 100 people joined investment banking. I think I was one, maybe like one and a half. Someone else was sort of like mixed.
Yeah.
Wow. Like, and I think that was something that I was used to being always like the Asian person in the room. And I think also that there is a lot of kind of class discrimination in the UK. And so what that means is that at university, even though, you've all been accepted to college, admittedly on like extracurricular or academic credentials, a lot of people will judge where you went to high school or where you went to, like kindergarten even before then. And so that will be the first question they ask you, which is, where did you go to school? Not meaning college, but like, where did you go before then?
Right.
And if you didn't go to the right school, then like some people wouldn't even want to talk to you. And so I think I felt those things more strongly in a way than being a woman. And I think like even at the time when I was in college and after college, I felt like being a woman was something that I could, could even be helpful. Like I saw that the women around me really like lit up the rooms that they kind of walked into. I had a mentor at Goldman called Anna Skoglund, and she was just like, really fabulous. And she used her femininity in a way to really like command gravitas in the room. Yeah. And I think she must have been like maybe 5'1". She was like a little petite Swedish woman. But she was really the energy, and she used, her people's, natural kind of attraction to her to like really command that presence. And I think that was something that I really learned a lot from.
Yes, I love that. I think oftentimes we talk about, being a woman and the negatives or, the hardships, but at the same time, what you're saying, it's like there's so many strengths that we can use. And I actually talked to a previous guest, and she mentioned how, for women, it's natural to practice empathy and lead with empathy. And maybe it's not as easier for men to do that. But I think what's amazing is, that's a strength. Like, use our strength. You're the only female in the room. Like, use that to your advantage. That's a great thing because you have your own perspective and whatnot. So I think you talk about that, which I love. And so tell me, your decision to go get an MBA from Stanford, go to Poshmark in California, was that like a crazy move? Because I know you ended up going back to England, but how was that process like? Was it kind of just, it's best for my career, or was it kind of hard to think about it?
Yeah, I think it's funny in a way because, you never know what's really true, right? Like I can tell you all these stories about how I now justify these events, but they're, just things that I made up after the fact, which like now make sense.
Right.
At the time, what happened was, so when you're in finance, you get all these phone calls. I think you do in any industry, and they're like, "Hey, do you want to work for such and such company?" And normally they call you about like hedge funds or private equity companies. And one day, someone called me about a venture capital firm, and I was like, "Oh, I don't know anything about this." So I called up the one friend I knew who had a startup, and he like told me about what venture capital was, and I was like, "Oh, cool. Well, maybe I could do this."
Yeah.
And so I went on to this interview. And he asked me all these questions. And basically, it was all these questions about a part of my life that I buried deep down in the box because I didn't want anyone to know how nerdy I was growing up. And the truth was, like, all the time growing up, I just spent, like, I think I had all my first friends, like, online. Like, and I think that was like every other kid, who's like an undergrad at Stanford. But in the UK, that was more rare.
Right.
And so I ended up working in venture capital after Goldman Sachs for a while. And so after that venture capital experience, it was really amazing. It really changed how I felt about my life. I felt always at Goldman Sachs that I was welcomed, but I didn't really like fit in truly. And I felt with the engineers and the VC that everyone really just adored me. And I was really good at what I was doing.
Yeah.
But I think, the one thing that was a bit of a, downer was that I spent a lot of time on video and on the phone call to people in California. And there was a big time difference. And I was like, okay, all the cool companies in California, how do I get out there? And, around the time I was also applying to business schools, I was like, okay, maybe I could go to Stanford. This was a big way of getting out there. And so I really saw the time at Stanford. It was an amazing opportunity, not only to go to business school, but to also work with all these companies I also worked in venture capital at the time with an amazing woman called ADAY, who started something called Cowboy Ventures.
Yeah.
And it was just an opportunity to like really explore all of these things. And, you know, instead of reading about it on TechCrunch or on places, I could be there and meet all these companies.
Incredible. And Aileen Lee, I know her through a program I did at Stanford, the Mayfield Fellows Program, and she's doing all Rays, and she's incredible. I absolutely love her. And okay, so I have to ask, you mentioned when you had this interview for entering VC, you know, it really tapped into these nerdy things about you. What were some of those things that you loved doing that no one really knew about?
I had like a really early blog. I would have said this was probably like maybe like 2002 or 2003, and I had like millions of hits on it.
Oh my goodness!
I was like, ashamed of back then, you know. Whereas now, I'd like, you know, give me some like advertising fund for me.
Wow.
I also, you know, did a lot of gaming online, but I think it was also I did a lot of like IRC, but it was the sort of thing where you instantly in an interview with any engineer, I could put them at ease because they were things that they also did, right? I still want people, but I remember that, you know, really simple things like we were trying to find someone's contact information, and I was like, well, why don't we just do like a lookup on his like DNS? And I think back then that they, you know, especially coming out of a finance background, they didn't expect that from me, and but it really kind of helped me, you know, be welcomed into that culture.
Yeah, amazing. And then, so tell me now about coming to California. Had you ever been to America? Was this a crazy transition, or was it actually like, you know, you found your people who understood you and you felt like you belonged more than you had in your life? So how was that transition?
I think as, you know, someone who was raised between cultures, and I'd always like tried to travel a lot. Okay. The idea of like, you know, living in a new place didn't really faze me. But I think when I got there were definitely more hurdles than I expected. So I thought actually that Stanford was in San Francisco. It turned out that it wasn't. And I definitely did not believe. Everyone was like, oh, you need a car. I was like, no. I'm like really good at walking. I don't need a car. And, you know, I was proved wrong, all of these things. I bought a car. But I think that, you know, I had been to like New York before. And I knew that at some point in my life I would probably live in the US, but I didn't have set ideas of what or where.
Right.
And then, you know, I would say that after my time at Stanford, I thought I was going to live in the Bay Area for like, you know, the next 10 years. And that also turned out to be untrue. But I think that my main takeaway from those experiences is really that we should not have set expectations about, you know, who we are and, you know, where we are going to be. I think one of the best ways is probably to have a set idea of what am I optimizing for right now. So I'm in Stanford for learning. Here's, you know, what I'm interested in learning around. And then I think a lot of circumstances can change. Because I think when we have set expectations about like, you know, especially like who we are or where we are, they can often be disappointed, as we saw, you know, all over last year. And I think holding on to more loose ideas is much more helpful for that.
Yeah, I love that. So given that, I'm wondering, what's your take on goal setting? You know, like thinking of yourself 2 years from now, 5 years, 10 years, and you have this, you know, image, and a lot of people say like visualizing exactly what you want or writing down your goals can help a lot. How do you do that, or how do you balance that versus, you know, making sure you're not setting too high of expectations for yourself?
Yeah. I don't think it's too high in expectations. I think it's like what type of expectations they are, right?
I see.
So, for example, let's say I participate in a sport. You mentioned you played soccer.
Yeah.
And I'm like, okay, I am a soccer player. Then if I get injured, who am I, right? Like, what does that identity mean to myself, right? But I definitely believe that the goal could be I want to be world class at, you know, this. I think those things are separate from each other. But I think it's the part about identity. Like, I want to be a soccer player and I want to live in the Bay Area. Those are very discrete things. So I think we have less chance of controlling.
Wow.
So this year I rolled out a new goal setting thing for my company, which I'm really excited about. I think previously I was all over the OKRs, which are like actually a little bit complicated, and everyone has to negotiate with each other, and, you know, it's very detailed.
Yeah.
So we are trying this new thing where everyone just sets one goal, one business goal and one personal goal. And the only thing that matters is it has to be really important to you. So not to anyone else. And so the reason why I asked everyone to set a personal goal is because our personal lives are so intermixed now with our business ones, right? So if you have a personal goal, right? Let's say you want to I don't know, like do more exercise or meditate or whatever it could be, sleep more. That's going to really affect your business goal. So we have to look at those two together, and we shared them with everyone in the company because we're so twined now that I think it's really about everyone supporting each other. So I think, now it's more about empathy, and, maybe this is like a very female-led thing, rather than like what is the biggest goal that you can, achieve. Because I think especially in this sort of business and environment, this is really about how can we support each other rather than, what are these necessarily other goals. And then I used the like a Tim Ferriss method, which is more like I just pick 2 or 3 things in the next 6 to 12 months within I want to do something, I want to have something, and they're just ideas that I work towards, and then I go backwards from there. Oh. So if it was something like I want to buy a house, I do not have anything. It's like I want to buy a house on that. But I would work backwards from that to be like, how do I get the first deposit and understand what that minimal viable first step is, I guess.
Wow, I love that. And I was curious, I'm glad you mentioned it. I was curious whether for your company it's kept private or, everyone knows exactly what everyone's striving to get to. So I like that. I love that practice. And okay, so at business school, maybe a little after when you're still in venture capital, when did you start to plant the seed that maybe one day I'll be starting my own business and yes, you'll be starting it versus, choosing to go to Poshmark and beyond?
So I thought I was going to start my own company like several years after business school, and I ended up starting it I think like a year and a half after business school. I was going to get like industry experience, work my way up, probably be like a director, VP or something at a startup. And so what happened is that both of my parents became ill, and so I moved back to the UK to support them. And one of the people that I'd actually met at Goldman Sachs, and she actually went into venture capital afterwards. She went to work at Index Ventures. Her name is Nina Feuhaber. We got in touch again, and we'd been in touch throughout my time at business school. And we both always thought at the back of our heads, like, wow, we work really well together. We could work together. And we just started, I started working out of our office at Index Ventures. And we just, started talking about different ideas. It was very there was no moment that was sort of, let's start a company. It was more, she was like, yo, I'm ready to start a company. Are you on a board? And I was like, no. Like, I have things I'm going to sort out. Like, I have to take my dad to hospital. But she was like, I'm ready. Like, and here's why. Like, this is a great time for us to do it. And I think kind of here we are. And I think that's an interesting idea, right? Like, I think in any relationship, one person's the leader at any one time, and it doesn't have to be the same person. But what is important is that you switch between each other, right? Sometimes someone else is leading, sometimes you are. And I think definitely at the time, it wasn't that I didn't want to, but I just didn't have that amount of space in my head. But I think the other one kind of crucial moment that happened there was, so when I had left Poshmark, and Poshmark just filed its S1, it's going to be a public company, so that's really exciting. I was unemployed, and I was like, a year and a half out of business school. I felt like a super failure. And I actually ran into the head of admissions at the Stanford Business School in London. And, he was going around the room, shaking people's hands, like, what are you up to? What are you up to? And, he wants you to tell him that you've been fundraising, you've been promoted, you bought a company or whatever it could be. And I was like, I'm unemployed. And, my parents are really ill, and I came back to the UK for my family. And the first question that they ask you when you apply to business school at Stanford is, what matters to you the most and why? And he just laughed, and he said, what matters to you most and why is your family right now. And that's really great that you prioritize that. And I think that really summed up for me, a lot of my experience in California. I thought Stanford was a business school which really combined leadership and business, but also a lot of empathy and really understanding those things. And I think in the UK, and especially at Goldman, there were so many things I was so ashamed of, right? Like sharing personal goals, my family is ill, and I would feel so afraid to talk about these things. And I think at Stanford, it really embraced this idea of I can be my whole person, and by bringing my whole person to the room right now, that's how I do my best work.
Wow, I love that. And it's almost, and I'm sure you've obviously brought that to ADAY and where you are now with your company. And it's the value of being like authentic, being vulnerable. Because I think in Goldman and college, whatever, you didn't have that. So that's so cool. And so now,
Yeah,
when did you guys come up with ADAY? And tell me a little bit more about what ADAY is, and then the whole process to actually starting it.
absolutely. So ADAY is a direct consumer clothing brand, and we are setting the new standard for clothing. And so everything that we make is versatile, it's machine washable, it has incredibly luxe hand feel, and we really make everything with a very sustainable approach. So almost 70% of our products now are made from recycled or reused fabrics, and we're trying to improve that as time goes on. But I think this is really about revolutionizing the way that we see the fashion industry. I think there has been fast fashion industry, and there was like luxury goods, and then there were also people using recycled products, but the quality wasn't that high and a very plasticky feel. I think everything we make, the quality is just really tremendous. It feels like silk. It feels like very sort of weighted fabrics that you've kind of lived with your whole life. And because we expect your clothing to do more with less. And I think that's a concept that, we kind of landed on first, right? Like we knew who our customer was, which is, it was a woman who was someone like us. She's sort of busy in her life. She needs versatility. She needs simplicity. And it was interesting because recently we did like an analysis of our top customers. And they're like so much more than we could have even dreamed of. Like they're so cool. They're like, they have the coolest jobs. They're forensic, I can't even pronounce it, forensic anthropologists, or, someone was like a radiation oncologist. But, I think what was really amazing is we brought all this passion to the company, and our customers also bring all this passion to the work that they do. But we knew, Nina and I, that we wanted to kind of solve for this demographic. And we were like, what is an interesting product for this demographic? And that's how we kind of got to ADAY. And I think especially the fashion industry was incredibly uninspiring to us, right? There was a lot of not only fast fashion, but the products were just, they would shrink in the washing machine or they would turn pink. That was a level that I think a lot of people just felt was acceptable. But we really felt that, in every other industry, every single year, products get better. But in fashion industry, they seem to kind of get worse.
Yeah.
And people think that, just changing the color up was enough. And so each of our products they are reinvented over time. So we change up the fabrics, we change up the fit, and we use a lot of customer data to kind of do that. So it's very much like what any other technology company would do.
Yeah, so cool. And obviously, starting a company is far, far from easy. And so, like, take me back to those early stages, the first year. What were some challenges you had, and did you ever have doubt within you and your co-founder saying, okay, maybe I got to go back to Poshmark or just another company and work my way up? Did you ever have those doubts, or was it more just the passion was driving you?
I think, definitely, I think it's just sort of like dating, right? Like, I think when you first start dating someone, like they're really interesting, but someone else who's like pretty shiny comes along, you're like, you're pretty interesting as well. And I think because I had like Stanford on my resume, and one of the things that I did with Aileen Lee was we wrote an article in TechCrunch called Welcome to the Unicorn Club, and we coined the word unicorns to mean the billion-dollar company. And because of that, like I felt like people in the UK were like throwing jobs at me like left and right. And I was like, wow, cool, like I could just take this job. And they were like really like good jobs, like really significant jobs. Like I was being offered like CEO roles at, there were jobs that I would not have been offered in California.
Wow.
And I think I got a little distracted with that at one point. But I think it wasn't so much that I didn't want to start a company, but it was just like there were other options that felt easier, right? And I think starting a company is hard, and you have to not only want to do it, but also be in the right mental space for it. And I think it needed a bit of time for me to kind of shift my mind so that I was in the right mental space for it. And I think, Nina was very patient through that time. And I think she was like, you have to be ready for this, right? You have to be all in. And, after a while, and it was also, coincided with my parents' treatment. They got further in their treatment. My dad had a stem cell transplant. I felt much more clear about my decision making.
Yeah.
So I think like when you're in a state of panic, it's easy to be like, I want the easy option. And in order to pick a hard option, you have to have a much more kind of clear like mindset.
Yeah.
And yeah, that was more what it was about.
And so, first of all, coining the term unicorn. Okay, I love how you just like brushed through that quite quickly, but that's so cool. I love that. But okay, so you mentioned you have to be in the right mental state. Were there practices that you did to get to that? Like, do you meditate? Do anything to get in that mental state? Because as you said, it's not easy. You know, both your parents were ill, and like it's hard. It's not easy. So how did you really know? Okay, this is what I'm meant to be doing. It'll be challenging, but I'm okay to be there.
I think that is a great question. I think that's something that everyone talks about and probably doesn't, focus enough about. I think that not only that year, but probably for like the next 3 years, my main like extracurricular activity was really just like growing myself.
Yeah.
And I think that there were so many things within that, whether it was like, breathing or reading about, who I am. There's a great book called How to Be an Adult, which my therapist recommended. I did therapy. I got really consistent with like just my head and like giving time to it. I did a lot of yoga, but it was really like I couldn't. There were a lot of things that I cut down on. I think that in the Bay Area, I was much more like I was very social. I went out a lot, and in the UK, I was much more like strict. When we started a company, I like didn't really drink. I didn't really have caffeine even. I still don't. And it was really about who am I without all these influences, and what do I want. And I think that even when one does have a direction, right, like I wanted to do this company, I was still scared. And because I think when at the time I was I wasn't early in my career, but I was probably 24 or 25. And I think that there are these things that you worry about, right? Like how will this look on my resume if I fail? And ultimately, these things don't really matter. But what I didn't have back then was, any sort of experience where I could say, oh, I know that this won't matter in X amount of years when a future employer looks at me. And when other people told me that, I wouldn't believe them. But then what I realized was, if I just did this for a year and it failed, it would be fine, right? Like I knew other people who had done that. But I think also, doing that yourself is very scary.
Yeah. Okay, so I love this. So many valuable pieces of advice, but specifically the last point. So you said, it's hard in the moment to say, okay, this won't matter, in 10 years, 5 years time on my resume. Do you have advice for in that moment, you're in the moment, you're trying to get a job, and obviously you put a lot of pressure on yourself. Are there things to do in that moment where you can, other than just maybe hoping that it won't matter, but you don't know, at the moment you think everything's important. Do you like looking back at your career, looking back at everything you've done, how you would do it differently and trying to change your mental state about it?
I think that before every big decision, like personal or business, I have a couple of people that I reach out to, right? And so what I try to do this thing is, they actually talk about it in that book, Designing Your Life. I try to live my life as if I had made that decision. So I always present these problems to my friends. I was like, hey, what do you think would happen if this, or like, what do you think if I did this? And then we basically like walk down the path of like what would happen and the risks, right? And I think after, you share this with the people in your life who know you the best and the smartest, you kind of can come to a conclusion. But then I think the other point is it also depends on how risk averse you are and how risk seeking you are, right? So you can have all these options. And I also know plenty of people out there who would be like, okay, I understand, cognitively all of these things, but they're still really, I'm really scared of making that decision, right? And I think that's like a totally valid place to be. Yeah. I think risk seeking is like a behavior that almost has to be curated in some people, and some people have too much of, and it's hard to like find the midpoint of that, right? Yeah. Like when is the right time to like lose all my money or to invest my money into something. So I think it really just comes down to a balance of everything. Yeah. But I think that, one thing is that I think people think of entrepreneurship as such a great thing, and that is like an ideal that you should get to at the end of the path. I think it's one thing that one can do. I really don't think it's for everyone. Yeah. I think that there's a lot of risk with it, and there's also a lot of people who would be very, they would be kept up every night by the idea of like, oh, what if I can't make payroll this month, and I can't pay all my employees. And I think that these are very particular things that someone has to like really enjoy embracing. And I don't think entrepreneurship is the end path for everyone. I think some people really need to work at big companies. I think some people are amazing CEOs and operators, and that's very different to being a founder. Yeah. And I think that these are all just like different roles for ourselves. None is better than another.
Yeah, incredible. I actually took a class, I don't know if you know Tina Seelig at Stanford, and she does this thing called the risk wheel. And there's like social risk, financial risk, emotional risk, all these different scenarios, and everyone has kind of a different scale for their risk appetite. So I think, yeah, it's great. Okay, Meg, for my last two questions, I've loved this, by the way, so really thank you for coming on the show. For my last two questions, first, what's a passion that you have that's completely unrelated to any work, just another passion of yours?
Yeah, I compete at Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu. I've been doing it for a few years now. I'm a blue belt. But I was very proud last year. I came third at the European Championship.
Oh my goodness, that's crazy.
My team made me take like 2 weeks off work, where I was like, guys, I'm going to be like a semi-professional athlete for 2 weeks. Don't disturb me. And it was great.
Wow. When did you start that? When did you start that sport?
In like, I think 2018. But I think I just felt like a little. I didn't win at the highest level. It was at the beginner level. But it's still like. That's really hard for me is I fight mostly 18-year-olds, and they have a lot of energy. And it was very funny because they're going onto the mat and they're talking about their like college classes, and they need to find an internship. I'm like, I'm much older than you. You could be my child.
Oh my goodness, that's so funny. I love that. Okay, as a final question, I'm not going to let you say jiu-jitsu for the final one because it's not hidden. So what is a hidden talent that you have? So no one really knows about it, but it's a weird talent. So I'm going to go first before you go. And so what I do is I usually throw blueberries in there and catch them in my mouth. But I don't have blueberries, so it's going to be a cashew. We moved on to nuts, but I need to get blueberries. All right, here we go. There we go.
Wow, that's amazing.
Thank you. Years of practice.
Awesome. I really like training dogs. And I used to train rescue dogs.
Wow.
I have a dog with me, but I don't know if he's going to demonstrate. He's very engrossed in his sleeping.
Wow. What type of dog do you have?
Yeah. Let's say hi. This is Helix.
Oh, so cute. Oh,
he's a German Shepherd mix. He's 2.5.
Oh my God, what a cutie. I love that. Okay, well, Meg, thank you again for coming on the show. I've loved it. So many great pieces of advice. I'm so excited for others to just learn from you. So thank you.
Thank you so much for having me, Carly.
Of course.